Hey, everybody, and happy Sunday. So, this is going to be the last week of the semester, and I hope you guys are all okay and that you are doing your best around the house still, and that as we get to the end of this semester, um, you guys are not like losing your mind with school. You've made it this far. It's been a really crazy semester, but you've done a great job. And I am here always to help you out. So, without further ado, we will get into the last discussion question of this spring semester. All right, Reconstruction. That's really the topic, and we're doing full circle in a way, in that Reconstruction, the time after the Civil War, we're really the federal government under President Lincoln is really making an attempt to rebuild the Union, the whole country, bring everybody in who had seceded from the Union, all the southern states, some western states, didn't matter. What Abe Lincoln wanted to do, President Lincoln, he didn't want to punish anybody. And this is a really big concept. This is a really big deal. And it is one of the features of Abraham Lincoln's character and leadership qualities and characteristics that made him a real leader, a leader we look to even today in the 21st century. The reason why we have the Lincoln Memorial, the reason why we really put President Lincoln on a pedestal. He saw that this war, the Civil War, and the reacceptance of the southern states was a larger, the larger picture. It was bigger than him. It was bigger than what his personal feelings were. It was something that had to be done, and he understood. At least he worked hard to try and understand why the southern states seceded from the Union. And so when it came time for when the Civil War ended, to bring those states back, he didn't want to punish them. He wanted to bring them in. He wanted to, his intention was truly sincere, and he wanted to pardon all of the leadership of the Confederates, and I think that that's an amazing thought. I mean, the South and the Confederate States rejected the Union. It was a rational thought process. It was something they wanted to do. The reasons why they did it were convoluted, and they were wrong in their intention. But President Lincoln saw them still as part of the Union, men who fought for what they believed in. Wrong though it may be, or may have been, he still believed they were members of the United States of America. And so his response, his desire, his policies were about reconciliation. They were about pardoning these men who fought, forcefully rejected the Union. And part of the interesting things about Abraham Lincoln in this time was, if you remember, I think you should have read in your textbook about the 13th Amendment. And we still have issues with the 13th Amendment, the The movie by Ava DuVernay is a great movie and really speaks to it. But at the time, I believe, from a historian's perspective, my perspective, I do not believe that the 13th Amendment was initiated, the intent of the amendment was not to create the situation that it is now. President Lincoln made sure that the 13th Amendment was passed in the first month of his reelection, after his reelection, because he knew that the Emancipation Proclamation was really an executive order in the time of war. And so, as I mentioned last week, if he had attempted to negotiate with the Southerners, with the Confederacy, prior to the 13th Amendment being passed, then the country would be back to square one. And the issue of slavery would still have been on the table. And so what did all these men fight and die for? So he didn't want the war to be fought for nothing. And so he really worked very hard, very diligently, and was quite successful in getting the 13th Amendment passed. And that was really freeing of slaves. Bottom line, it was freeing of slaves and making ex-slaves citizens of the country. Citizens of the country. And if you remember in Dred Scott, the reason why Dred Scott couldn't win his freedom is because under the law, slaves were not citizens. They were not able to have, they didn't have rights. So now the 13th Amendment, makes free slaves and makes them a citizen. Okay, so when you become a citizen, then the Fifth Amendment is supposed to kick in, which is undue search and seizure, probable cause, these other things. But that's another story because we know that gets very convoluted with Jim Crow laws. So the 13th Amendment is passed. Now the biggest reason for the Civil War is that issue no longer exists. So now he can negotiate with the Confederacy, knowing that the reason for the Civil War, the major reason for it, is now doesn't exist. So how do we move forward? And like I said, the first thing that President Lincoln wanted to do is he negotiates the peace. He brings everybody back in. His initial idea was to pardon all of the leaders and have them take an oath of allegiance to the United States, to the Union of the United States of America, and then, start rebuilding the South. And he brings, Abraham Lincoln sends Union soldiers to the South, and they monitored the South, making sure, the Confederate States, really, to make sure that they are following the laws of the federal government, which was allowing people who were black, who were previous slaves, to be able to move about. They were free. And so the sheer presence of the Union Army in the Confederate States, or previous Confederate States at this point, ensures that federal law is going to be preserved. So remember, it's been a while, but remember, we've always talked through this entire semester about the conflict between states' rights and federal rights. Who has the power? Where's the power dynamic coming from? And at this moment in time, during 1877, or off through Reconstruction period, up to 1877, who really has the power? Initially, it's the federal government, and the federal government has officers in those Confederate states to ensure that everyone is abiding by the law. Now, because the Confederate States had been really mucked up quite a bit. Some of the places have been destroyed because that's what war does. War destroys an economy, war destroys buildings, war destroys infrastructure, war destroys a lot more than men and people. And in this time I'm saying men because men are fighting the wars. So it's not just about people dying directly tied to fighting one another, but it's all the collateral stuff. It just destroys lives all the way around. So with the need for rebuilding and bringing in new economies, new businesses, what happens? Well, people from the north come down and see an opportunity, an investment opportunity, and sure enough, the Southerners don't like them. They feel that these Northerners have come down and are taking over, and some of them are, because land is so cheap, because it's been so destroyed. The people who fought for the Confederacy, now they see them as outliers. These are people who shouldn't be here. These are people who are taking advantage of the situation, and they are. And they call them scallywags. And scallywags are also Southerners who work with the Northerners to help to rebuild. So you're going to find people on the South or on the Confederacy side who are going to welcome these Northern investors because they're going to get something out of it. And, that's in part capitalism. That's part of business. So you have that, but you also remember that the Civil War was fought over a war of ideology. And you just don't change your mind overnight. Even though people lost the war, doesn't mean that they've changed their mind. They still believe that if you're black, you should be a slave, and they don't consider people who are slaves to be human beings. So obviously that's not going to change overnight. And over time, once the Union soldiers leave, especially after the death, the assassination of President Lincoln, new policies get put into place that are not so forgiving, that are not so kind, and they, of course, end up being the policies to repatriate the Confederate States. The Union eventually does leave, and when the Union Army leaves these Confederate States, that's when we see the beginning of a slide backwards with regards to how people of color, previous slaves, are treated. And they go back to, not totally, but definitely there is a slide backwards in social acceptance of people who were once previous slaves. You see people who are black, who were once slaves, being beaten, lynched, used as scapegoats. There are many stories in the South in the late 1800s, all the way into the early 1900s, into the early 1920s even, that build on the ideas of the Old South, which is that whites are supreme, and that black people should be subordinate. And even though we have the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which gives suffrage, I think actually the 14th Amendment gives citizenship, but that is in 1865, right? So keep that in mind. You got 1865, you have the 13th Amendment. 1865, you have the 14th Amendment. 1866, you have the 15th Amendment, which gives all men who were once slaves the right to vote. Women are still not in this. We're looking at that in the 19th Amendment, 1920. But men are given the right to vote. So when you look at 1865, think about this now. If you would take a moment and ponder this in your mind. 1865 is the year, the 14th Amendment, that allows people of color who were once slaves to be citizens, with all due rights that all citizens have a right to have. The Bill of Rights, Fifth Amendment, illegal search and seizure. I mean, just, all of the inherent rights of all United States citizens. When we get the 15th Amendment, now there is no one, it says in the 15th Amendment, is allowed to infringe on a person's right to vote. And then it slides back. And believe it or not, it's not really in the South where Jim Crow laws begin. It's in Illinois. It's in some parts of the North where we get the beginnings of what's called Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws really say, hey, look, you can exercise your right to vote, but in order to exercise your right to vote, you're going to have to name every president and vice president since the country began. Oh, you can do that now? Okay, next year that person of color comes back and says, oh, well, you have to name every alderman in every county in the state of North Carolina. Now, who can do that? Nobody can do that. So they're saying, hey, I'm going to let you exercise your right to vote, but these are the hoops you have to jump through in order to exercise your constitutional right to vote. Now, I realize as we come into this year of presidential election that some of you may be ready, you're of age to vote. And just so you know that if you are currently 17 and you will be 18 by November when we do vote, you can go ahead and register to vote. So here's the thing. Here we are in 2020, and the number of people who vote in this country is dismally low. Dismally. The lowest percentage of people who vote in the world are here in the United States. And yet, here in the United States, we were the first people to create a government where folks could vote and they had a voice in the way they were governed. Now we come to after Reconstruction or after the Civil War, and we have new amendments that also help people who did not have the opportunity to vote before to get the opportunity to vote, to have a voice in their governance. That means that they are empowered to have a voice in what they believe in. And you might say, well, Ms. Khan, it's 2020 and it's just me and it's just one vote. And I would say you need to Google up how many votes some elections were lost by. Your vote counts. Your voice counts. And here in 1865, when the 14th Amendment passed and the 15th Amendment, it took 100 years, guys, 100 years, in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act to reinstate the 14th and 15th Amendments, to reinstate and make sure that people could always exercise their right to vote. Pretty big deal. Pretty big deal. So, Reconstruction is a tough time. I would encourage you all to watch. There's a couple of really good movies. One is called The Free State of Jones, and that is with what is his name? Matthew McConaughey. Free State of Jones, very good. There's also another movie called with Nicole Kidman. Not Black Mountain. I'll try and put it in in Blackboard. But there are some really good movies out there that help you understand what was going on in the South and in the Confederate States during the Civil War that really ended up leading to them losing the war. Some things that are just, Cold Mountain. That's the one. Cold Mountain and Free State of Jones. Those are two good movies that are addressing what is happening in the South during the Civil War and just after the Civil War. I think they're pretty accurate too. And the acting, of course, is great. You have Jude Law and Nicole Kidman in one of them, and then some other really good stars too. But they tell a story that it isn't all sweetness and light, but it's a good, at the end of the day, it's a good story, and it helps you understand what the Confederate States were going through. Because if you remember from last week, I told you that the North had a larger population, they had industrialization, so their supply chains were good. They had enough men to actually keep the army with enough manpower, but the South didn't. And over time, Confederate soldiers were going AWOL. They were just deserting, and for good reason. I mean, if you look at it from their perspective. And I think that's an important, those are two good movies that you could watch while we're kind of still on lockdown. President Lincoln had a really hard job. He had a really, really hard job. And in times of trouble, when a country or when a region or state is vulnerable because they're at war, or they have wars of ideology, there's a big ideological difference between the way one group of people do things as opposed to another. And then they have to come together to try and recreate and rebuild a society. During those vulnerable times, leaders rise up. Some leaders are very bad leaders. Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin. Some leaders are very, very bad leaders, and we can go all the way back to the beginning of time. And then there are these leaders who rise up and meet the challenge and are really able to make a difference. And their legacies live on for generations. And Abraham Lincoln is one of them. He rose above all he had to deal with. And for those of you who watch the movie Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, I would hope that, I hope you do, even if you didn't for extra credit. He was able to bring the country back together again, and it was unfortunate, to say the least. I mean, that's not even a right way of saying it. I mean, it was devastating to this country that he was assassinated, and it continued to keep a rip open, a tear open in the country for a very long time, and I think we're still trying to heal from that time. I really do. I do think that come full circle issues about race, institutionalized racism, the movie The 13th by Ava DuVernay, and various other documentaries and films that are being done now to help us understand the depth of institutionalized racism and biases that we live with um, really do help us understand where we are in 2020, and I think that it does us all good to make sure that we do recognize where we are right now, how long it took us to get here, the great strides we have made for African Americans, for communities of color, for women, the LGBTQ community. I mean, we're just moving forward. We are making great strides. But I also think that we still have a great deal of work to do. And studying American history and what transpired in the Civil War and just after really helps us, I think, move forward and helps us keep our compass on the straight and narrow to, what do we really want in the end. And so, not just for this country, but as a global community, I think that's important. So, guys, that's really it for this textbook and for this semester. I will be looking over the presentations next week. I am around if you need me, and I miss you guys, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the fall. Okay? Mwah! Love you, miss you, and I'll see you soon. Bye.